And we're live.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Weiss. I am the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a steering committee member of the NDP Socialist Caucus. We acknowledge that we are hosting this event on Indigenous lands, including the unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's webcast is titled The War Measures Act 50 Years On. It features Marc Bonhomme, an anti-capitalist activist in Quebec Solidaire in Montreal, and John Riddell, who organized in 1970 against the repression as a leader of the Ligue, socialiste, Ouvrier, and Robbie Mahood, SALAS leader in Quebec today. And I will be hosting the show. Marc will give a talk for about 25 minutes, followed by John Riddell, who will speak for about 5, and then Robbie that will speak between 5 and 10. Then we'll take a few questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the webcast directly from YouTube and by typing the question directly onto the chat column, and this can be done at any time during the speeches. Please direct your question to a specific person if you wish, or for all three. If you like this webcast, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. If you agree with what you hear during the program, please join Socialist Action by signing up at our website, www.socialistaction.ca. That's www.socialistaction.ca. Or just by giving us a call, 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917, and it's an easy number to remember. 1917 was the year of the Russian Revolution. So let's begin. Marc Bonhomme is a writer, political analyst, and socialist activist in Quebec Solidaire. The QS is a left social democratic sovereignist party with 10 members in the Quebec National Assembly. Marc produces a widely read anti-capitalist blog in French. So welcome, Marc.
Merci. Bonsoir. Good evening. Because my English is not that good, you probably received half an hour ago a written presentation. So I will follow that presentation with some comments maybe. So in the events, my topic would be the events of October 1970 from yesterday to today. In 1970, the national question and the social question were merged, especially in Montreal. To use the language of that era, the big bosses were English, the overwhelming Francophone working class was exploited as well as oppressed, and vice versa. Language on sign, in the workplace, and the names of company were predominantly in English. If you would be in Montreal in 1960, you would think it was an English city. A petit bourgeois quiet revolution that was not so quiet from 1960 to 66 was followed by a proletarian quiet revolution from 1966 to 76, which was not quiet at all. The important point actually in the second part was the 1972 general strike, where there was a beginning of a pre-revolutionary situation, but it's not my topic today. The latter was defeated by the hegemony of the petit bourgeois PQ, whose social project was the construction of Quebec Inc., which enjoyed temporary success with the Ottawa Help, for example, in supporting Bombardier and SNC-Lavalin. We often think of Ottawa as a repressor. Well, that was the stick part, but there was a carrot side of helping of building a Quebec wing of the Canadian bourgeoisie. The event of October 70 expressed a lack of confidence from that the proletarian but inarticulate project of national liberation combined with social emancipation could succeed. The relative electoral success of the left-wing independent RIN in 1966 with 6% of the vote gave way to the PQ with a right-wing sovereignty association orientation. The PQ first swallowed up the independent right-wing RN and then, against the will of its left wing, the RIN, enabling it to receive 23% of the vote in the election of 1970, just before the October, in the spring of 70, just a few months before the October events. Montreal Mayor Jean Drapeau's draconian anti-demonstration repression did the rest, creating the illusion of a Quebec that was a Cuba of the North, in line with the armed national liberation struggle of that era. And I remember talking with Paul Rose, the most important people in that October event, and he gave a lot of importance to that anti-demonstration rule of the mayor of Montreal. For him, that was proof that there was no democracy in Quebec. So the use of the arm was justified, politically speaking. This was a very impressionist analysis presented in the favorite book of the time, Pierre Vallière, Nègre Blanc d'Amérique, on which there was a controversy recently in the CBC, I think. Vallière did not differentiate between the African American who endured slavery and the Jim Crow system and the white Quebec people who were caught between the hammer of federalist oppression following the conquest of 1760 and the defeat of the National Democratic Revolution of 1837-38, and the anvil of their own participation in indigenous oppression and in the Canadian imperialism as a junior partner. As far as the indigenous oppression is concerned, there's quite a debate actually in Quebec on a very ugly event where an Atikamekw woman died in hospital after being insulted with racial insults by a nurse. And I think that event now is spreading all over the world. So the consolidation of the global market of the neoliberal era has really cut back the pretension of Quebec Inc. To give even more than Canada Inc. For example, in the food sector, Provigo and IGA were bought by the Canadian companies Loblaw and Sobeys. In the hardware sector, Rona was bought by the US company Lowe's. In IT prevails the dominance of the French company Ubisoft and for video game, and the American Microsoft and Google for artificial intelligence. In entertainment, Cirque du Soleil has been bought by its Anglo-Canadian and American creditors. And let us add the rout of Bombardier for the benefit of Airbus and Alstom, and SNC-Lavalin, which is engulfed in financial scandals. Actually, Quebec Inc. is simply disappearing. Of course, there remain Financial, Desjardins, and National Bank, and in the national resource sector, the state-owned Hydro-Québec. The fall of Quebec Inc. brought in its wake a parallel decline and crisis of the PQ. Still claiming to be independentist, the PQ tried in vain to maintain itself by reviving the identitarian nationalism seen in the great darkness of the Duplessis era between 1936 and 1960, except during the Second World War when there was a liberal government. But this is not back to the future like in 1960 or 70. The people of Quebec are no longer the hewers of wood and the carriers of water of yesteryear. The revenge of the cradle is no more. The Quebecois have become a modern people, familiar with all the contradiction of neoliberal society, including a very low birth rate, which raised the question of the necessity of immigration, integrated mostly in French, for its survival. And that's quite a debate in Quebec, actually. An educated, cosmopolitan, and progressive, but rather modest income urban center layer has emerged. Whether as a new proletariat or a new middle class, that's a debate going on. A part of this layer has found expression in Quebec Solidaire, even in the transfer, if the transfer of loyalty from the PQ to QS is not yet completed. The urban layer explained the relative electoral success of QS because of its concentration vote, which means 10 deputies for 16% of the vote in 2018, as compared with the PQ in 1970, which had 7 deputies for 23% of the vote. Compared to the early PQ, QS has been slower to emerge electorally and without any future guarantee. The more traditional base of the PQ, coming from the suburbs and region, has shifted its allegiance to the CAQ, the oldest part and the least exposed to the ethnic and social pluralism of the modern people of Quebec, prefer the federalist CAQ, the authentic ear of Duplessis, Union Nationale, with a French-Canadian identity ideology, in clear contradiction to the increasing multi-ethnic reality of Quebec, especially in the Greater Montreal. Just as some time ago, before the Me Too movement, many young women no longer felt the need for feminism. Part of the urban Francophone youth, even progressive ones, have been influenced by the neoliberalism and no longer feel the need to defend the French language. We are far from the 1960 French McGill or Saint Léonard movement, which filled the street and led to the events of October 1970. As a result, the youth is no longer ready to mobilize directly for independence, despite the fact that Canada's constitutional non-recognition of the Quebec nation remains total, just as Quebec bashing is still popular in English-speaking Canada. In Quebec, the French language is having some difficult times, particularly in the Greater Montreal, where 50% of the population of Quebec lives. Young people worried about their future are above all preoccupied with ecology. They are faced with catastrophic global warming and decline in biodiversity, now combined with the health emergency and the form of the pandemic and a major economic crisis. The progressive part of the youth want to build a pluralist unity of peoples against highly concentration and globalized finance, capitalism, the famous 1% of Occupy Wall Street. This accounts for the prominence of democratic concerns, especially vis-à-vis racialized people and indigenous nation, and a redistributive anti-inequality, anti-poverty preoccupation. The result is a distrust of nationalism and ethnic exclusivity, with which the PQ and CAQ largely dominate the sleeping national movement, including the independence component. Quebec Solidaire should be the counterweight to this retrograde tendency, which of course is not only Quebecois, but global in scope, reviving great nation chauvinism or narrow nationalism in reaction to neoliberalism, globalism, but which has repercussion on the internationalism induced by the ecological struggle. QS presents itself as an environmentalist and independence party, but the two aspects are disjointed. Its ecological is clearly reformist, from which flow soft, all-electric, pro-company, market-accommodating policies requiring no strategic break with the Toronto-Calgary axis, but perfectly achievable within the framework of provincialism. Its independence ideology, inspired by Option Nationale, a collective coming from the ultra wing of the PQ, posit the nationalism of an independent Quebec, more competitive on the world market thanks to its natural resources and going in the direction of green capitalism with its hydroelectricity, lithium mining, manufacturing of batteries, and hydroelectric vehicles. This programmatic weakness, which has repercussion on the democratic functioning of the party and on the high priority given to parliamentary work, manifests itself in the rise of the far right in the streets, surfing on the contradiction of the pandemic policy of the CAQ, forced to more repression following the failure of its policy of accelerated reopening of the economy. At QS last Conseil National on September the 12th, the delegates expressed dissatisfaction with the anti-pandemic policy of the party, which has largely tail-ended the CAQ, whose management, as I just told you, of the COVID-19 outbreak has been catastrophic and remains so. A second wave is upon us and coming fast. The left of the party, through its political commission, succeeded in opening a breach in this programmatic timidity toward an alternative society of care by proposing the hiring of 250,000 people in the public sector and by the nationalization of the sector public transport, private health, and education. At the suggestion of IRIS, the think tank of the Quebec left. IRIS is a bit like the CCPA in Ottawa for English Canada. But the balance of power remains so favorable to the leadership of the party that it has been able to completely ignore this resolution, even going so far as not to participate in the Montreal version of the global demonstration for climate justice on September the 25th, because its demands were too radical. To use an expression of Paul Rose, who was at the center of the events of October 1970, national liberation and social emancipation, to be reclassified today as socio-ecological emancipation, spontaneously joined 50 years ago, must be joined politically today. Failing to achieve this, the national struggle of the Quebec people will be taken over by the right, including the Patriots' flag by the extreme right, as we have seen for some time. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. I'm sorry for this literally reading, but my capacity to speak English, I've lost some capacity in the last 10 years since I retired from the federal government, where I did speak it a lot. But in the last 10 years, I read in English, but I don't speak English very much. Merci. Bonjour. Bonsoir, plutôt.
Okay, thank you very much. And your English was fine, comrade. Okay, the next speaker is John Riddell. John is the author of several books on the Communist International in the 1920s. He organized in 1970 against the repression as a leader of the Ligue, socialiste, Ouvrier. John was the executive secretary of the LSO, Ligue for Socialist Action, a predecessor party of today's Socialist Action. So welcome, John.
Well, hello. So glad to be with you this evening. I can be heard okay?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Marc, for that wonderful description of events in Quebec over the last 50 years. Now, I was asked to speak on how we in the socialist movement in Canada responded to the War Measures Act 50 years ago. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to take a little more time than I said previously, maybe more something closer to the 10 minutes I was originally offered, and say a bit about what the October crisis, the War Measures Act crisis, was 50 years ago. Now, as Marc described, the situation in Quebec at that time was one of a very dramatic and convulsive social upsurge of struggles both of national and social liberation, with the working class definitely in the lead in the mass struggles. And at the same time, the rise of a bourgeois nationalist party, the Parti Québécois, led by René Lévesque, which succeeded in early 1970, as Marc said, in obtaining a very, very good score in the election that showed clearly that there was mass support in Quebec for independence as the way that national liberation should be pursued. At the same time, this was in an atmosphere of massive student struggles and labor struggles, and also off on the fringe, a organization of individual terrorism, or rather a series of groupings that used a common name, the Front de Libération du Québec, that is the Quebec Liberation Front, who carried out a variety of violent protest actions. And in the fall of 1970, one group of this, calling themselves FLQ, abducted an ambassador, and another group then abducted a minister of the Quebec government. And at this situation, there was growing tumult in Quebec and considerable indications of sympathy for the militants of the FLQ who had carried out these actions, not for the kidnappings themselves, but for the spirit of resistance. There were mass meetings in which this was expressed. And it seemed that things were getting out of hand. And the prime minister at the time, Pierre Trudeau, the father, said famously, "You want to know what I'm going to do? Well, just watch me." And that's what we found out on the morning of October 16th, 1970. And I'll change my text. On October 16th, the news of the War Measures Act was all over radio and TV. Now, what was the War Measures Act? That's a polite term for what is normally called martial law. That means that when war is declared, the ruling class says that all civil liberties are suspended. There are arbitrary mass arrests, detention without charges or court supervision, and the country placed under military rule. Now, that's what the government did back in 1914 and 1939 when the World War was declared. But what the government was now doing was it's saying what is happening in Quebec is equivalent to a war. Well, a war of who against whom? They called it an insurrection. That is, that the mass movement in Quebec was set to take over power in Quebec, and something drastic had to be done to stop this. Now, this, of course, was imaginary. There was no intent or plan to carry out an insurrection in Quebec at this time. It was just a device that the ruling class used in order to carry out their operation to smash civil liberties, and in this way to throw back the working class and nationalist movements. And so on the morning of October 16th, we found that Quebec was under military occupation, that hundreds of people, their names were not known, were under detention. They had been seized during the night in early morning raids. This was without any charges against them, without any court supervision. They were simply detained because the government wanted them detained, and they were going to sit there for the duration as long as the government wanted. Quebec was under military rule. And by the way, the denial of civil liberties applied to the entire country, although it was not pursued as vigorously in English Canada as it was elsewhere. So that's what we woke up to that morning in Toronto. We of the Toronto branch of the Ligue for Socialist Action phoned the headquarters in Montreal, but no answer. Then we phoned other comrades, the editor of our paper, no answer. We phoned around. Then finally some news. Our Quebec editor, that is of our French language newspaper, and another comrade had simply disappeared. And no protests, of course. Working class politics was utterly shut down. You couldn't do simple things like hire a hall or get material printed. You couldn't do it in Montreal. You couldn't do it in Toronto either. The left was silenced. Now, please remember, this was 50 years ago. We didn't have any social media then. It was very hard to communicate. We didn't have home printers, for example. There was no internet. To spread the word, we did it in person, by leafleting, by telephone, or by Canada Post. No chance of getting into the mass media. That was all run by people who run the country. So in that context, how could we speak out and get a hearing? The organization in Toronto sent me down by the first train to Montreal to see what was going on there and to coordinate between the Montreal and Toronto operations to get things going again. So I left the train in Montreal, found out that the subways were running, which was good news. We got to the general area where my comrades and friends lived, hit the streets, and was startled. Soldiers in full battle gear guarding the intersections with assault rifles in hand. Looking rather quizzically, I thought, wondering why they were there, but they certainly looked dangerous enough. Well, I soon managed to track down our Montreal group. With about 30 members, they had gone underground. Ongoing arrests were likely, we thought. The headquarters was too dangerous to use. So the comrades removed our key asset. And can you imagine what that is in the pre-internet era? The key asset is our card file of contacts. They drove it out of Montreal, took it to the farm of a friendly comrade out in the rural area and buried it on the farm. Actually, to our amazement, the police arrived at that farm a couple of days later. It turned out that our friend out there had a brother who was friendly with the Belcu. Anyway, that's the way it goes when you try to go underground. You certainly don't do it quite right. But in any case, the card file was not found. That was fine. We set up a safe house. We functioned from a couple of motel rooms, and there we were. By that evening, we were going again. And it was clear that the mass arrests were not continuing. So we had a discussion, sitting around the crowded end of the motel room, and defined our aims. Help to build the protest movement now taking shape across the country. Break through the gag law by publishing and widely distributing our views. Reopen our public office right away and help take the lead in the public resistance. We had one thing going for us. Montreal was in a civic election campaign and was going to vote for its mayor a few days later. And we had a candidate of the Ligue for Socialist Action, Ligue socialiste, Ouvrier, in the field, a young and able activist, Manon Ligue. We had another asset. Back in Toronto, we had our own small private print shop, outside police control. We started work in both cities on emergency editions of our newspapers to be printed in both English and French, printed in large quantities for mass distributions. Then we carried out a measure to test the relationship of forces and political atmosphere under war measures. 3 days after war measures, we organized Montreal's first street action against the crackdown. We planned it to be small, aiming to test out the scope for public protest without risking too much. Manon Ligue was with us that day. We went to the armories of the Canadian forces at Bleury and Ontario in downtown Montreal, home of the Black Watch Regiment, symbolic of Anglophone occupation of Quebec. And we started picketing and leafleting right there on the street beside the armed soldiers. And we chanted, without much social distancing either. We went right beside them and chanted, "Withdraw the federal troops, free political prisoners, la mairie aux travailleurs," for a workers' city hall, and kept that up for some time. After about an hour, we were arrested. Several hours later, they figured out what to do with us. We were charged with the grievous crime of, quote, sporting political insignia within a week of an election. And we were released. And no more was heard about those charges. In other words, they did not dare invoke the War Measures Act, a clear victory for freedom of speech and a measure of a relationship of forces. 3 days later, we received 11,000 newspapers in French for use in Montreal.
1 minute, comrade.
We distributed them widely in campuses and workers' districts. There were no arrests. Activists took note. Conditions were good for broad protest activities. Manon Léger got some media breaks. While opposing kidnapping as a method, she defended those who carried it out, saying that the real source of violence was economic and national oppression. She picked up on a widespread sentiment. All Quebecers were hostages, part of a kidnapped nation, kidnapped 200 years before. In the mayoralty election, Manon picked up a quarter of the opposition vote. By then, an impressive civil liberties campaign was underway, led by a new coalition, the Front Commun pour la Liberté. The left in Quebec, thrown back by brutal oppression, was on the march once more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, comrade. It's very, very good. Okay, so now we will hear from Robbie Mahood, physician, past Quebec Solidaire candidate, and leader of SALAS in Montreal. Welcome, Robbie.
I didn't hear my introduction, Elizabeth, but anyway.
Okay, I introduced you.
Yeah, I know. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak tonight. I am a member of the Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste, Socialist Action, which is sponsoring this webinar. I'd like to thank Marc Bonhomme for setting the October crisis 50 years ago in a historical and political context, right up to the present moment. And also to that very inspiring, really, recall the role of the comrades of the LSA-LSO in that moment of crisis. I hadn't heard that story before, and I really hung on every word. It was very inspiring. So I'm going to try to address, first of all, the question of Quebec independence. I'm presuming here that our audience is predominantly from English-speaking Canada. And so I will somewhat tailor the remarks to that audience. Well, there's no denying that the question of Quebec independence, unlike in 1970, is hardly the burning question of the moment. There have been many changes in Quebec society in the intervening years. So I want to pose a question. Could it be that the question of independence has been superseded and that Quebec's national grievances have been accommodated or can be further accommodated within the Canadian Federation? Well, I think that's a fair question. And it's a question to which a large swath, I believe, of political opinion in English-speaking Canada would answer in the affirmative. And here I speak not just of the usual suspects in the center of the political spectrum, but also of a large component of left-wing opinion in Canada, where who don't necessarily hold the Canadian state in as a sacred institution, but are nevertheless convinced that the day of Quebec independence has passed. As Marc pointed out, even the radicalizing youth in Quebec today are much more concerned with looming eco-catastrophe, with systemic racism, economic insecurity, and widening inequality than with the independence question for Quebec, if independence even appears on their radar. And they don't seem to be making the connections between these questions that preoccupy them and the question of national liberation in Quebec. However, having said all this, I think that consigning Quebec independence to the wastebasket of history would be entirely premature. A look back at the October crisis reminds us that when all is said and done, there remains an unresolved national problem at the heart of the Canadian Federation, or rather, perhaps we should say several unresolved cases of national oppression. There is an increasing awareness of this with respect to First Nations peoples, and that is certainly a giant step forward and merits our closest attention and solidarity. The left is wont to transfer its sympathies, arising out of awareness of settler colonialism and its terrible legacies, to the cause of the Indigenous people. But I think it would be fair, have tended to neglect the question of Quebec's oppression, national oppression, however much there may be differences between it and the situation of the Indigenous peoples. But I think it is wise not to erase the Quebecois from this optic of national oppression in the Canadian state. The Quebecois are the colonizers who themselves were colonized. And that's a very important realization from Canadian history. And their path, the path of the Quebecois to social and national emancipation, is still blocked. Now, if we cast an eye back to the national and class upheavals of Quebec's Quiet Revolution, which as Marc said, was not quiet, but neither was it quite a revolution. Perhaps we should adopt the framework of an interrupted or temporarily contained revolution, and that may prove to be the most pertinent vantage point with which to view the question of Quebec. What was lacking, however, in Quebec 50 years ago and continues to be absent today is a mass independent working class party with a program for socialist transformation. We should revise that to say eco-socialist transformation, which will require a workers' government in Quebec and a break with the Canadian federal state. Now, Quebec Solidaire seems to be moving away from transforming itself in that direction towards a reincarnation of the Parti Québécois as it is imagined to have been some 50 years ago. Not necessarily the way the PQ was, but at best, we see Quebec Solidaire trying to reincarnate that vision of a social democratic PQ. Now, we in Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste certainly salute those in Quebec Solidaire who are fighting to defend an eco-socialist program in the framework of social and national liberation. Some rearguard actions are worth fighting if the principle of class independence is not breached. It's not entirely clear that that applies in the case of Quebec Solidaire, but that's really a discussion for another time. In any case, we would submit that the building of a revolutionary socialist nucleus is critical to advancing the mass struggles that are on the horizon, including the construction of a mass revolutionary party, which is eco-socialist, which seeks to combat women's and all other forms of oppression, and which is committed to workers' power. Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste is as yet a small revolutionary Marxist organization confined to Montreal, but with growing forces as Socialist Action across the Canadian state, and we hope to see better in Quebec as well. We urge you to join our organization if you share the perspective I've outlined and you want to contribute to the historical transformation we so desperately need. Now, I want to also, in the vein of reminiscences, I wanted to share some reflections from my own biography, political biography of the October crisis, which of course I did live through, but at a distance. I came of age politically in the Saskatchewan of the 1960s, not exactly the boiling point of the international class struggle, but it did have its moments, principally around the struggle to bring in Medicare in 1962. The rising up of Quebec at that time was not news to anyone, and least of all to radicalizing youth and the generation of which I was a part. In 1965, I helped to bring in Pierre Bourgault, a leader of the RIN, a left independentist party, which unfortunately dissolved itself into the Parti Québécois. And he came to speak about Quebec on the campus at Saskatoon when I was a student there. Now, a more riveting and powerful orator I have yet to hear, and all in perfectly, only slightly accented English. I suppose that was a product of the deep-going cultural colonization of Quebec. But you know, it did make for a very unique experience with powerful oratory. Later in the decade, while at Regina campus, we brought in Charles Gagnon, the soft-spoken Felkiste intellectual. In October 1970, I was involved in writing and producing an alternative newspaper called Prairie Fire, which had a base of perhaps 500 subscribers across the province, which was not completely negligible. When the news broke of the kidnappings, and as the drama unfolded on our TV screens, we refused to denounce the abduction of the Laporte and Cross, and we published an English translation of the FLQ manifesto, an act that cost us not a few subscriptions, I can tell you. Truth be told, though, we were caught flat-footed by the kidnappings. Some had no hesitation in assimilating it to the armed actions, bombings and kidnappings, etc., that were quite common among national liberation movements at the time, and for which there was considerable sympathy. Against this, there were those who argued against terrorism or violent acts in the service of the cause. They presented either moral objections in some cases, or else the point that these kind of actions would isolate the left and unleash the forces of repression. In the wisdom of time, I think the latter position seems to have had the best of the argument. After moving to Quebec, I was involved for a time with the Parti pour la démocratie socialiste, PDS, whose leader at that time was Paul Rose, some years after his release from his 12-year prison sentence. I was intrigued, I may say, to learn much more about his roots in working class Montreal from watching the recent film Les Roses.
30 seconds, comrade.
Yeah, produced by his son Felix. I certainly commend this film to anyone who wants to learn more about the October crisis and the Quebec of that day. I want to add one further observation about the crisis, which only became apparent to me after moving to Montreal. That is that there were considerable efforts of prominent members of Quebec's nationalist intelligentsia, including figures such as Claude Ryan and Guy Rocher, to get the Quebec Liberal Prime Minister, Robert Bourassa, to resist Trudeau's interference. They wanted a Quebec response to the crisis centered on negotiations with the FLQ cells to secure the release of the hostages. But Trudeau was determined to impose the War Measures Act and sent his personal secretary, Marc Lalonde, to stand over Bourassa to ensure that he signed off on the War Measures Act. This provides a very telling glimpse into the essentially colonial relationship between Ottawa and Quebec. So that's the end of my remarks. Sorry to go over time a bit.
Okay, thank you, Robbie. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to our technical producer, Kurt Young, to put the questions forward. So you will read them slowly so you can write them down, or hopefully we will be able to put them up in the chat column. And each speaker will have up to 6 minutes each to answer the question, 1, 2, or 3, whichever you wish. And the order of speakers will be John, Robbie, and Marc. So, Kurt, go ahead.
Hi. So our first question is coming from JPL. And the question is, the FLQ was described as an independent movement. I think it was also engaged in foremost in an international revolution. Am I wrong? The next question comes from Barry Weisletter. Catalonia shows that the national question is still dynamic in imperialist countries like Spain and Canada. Likewise, the trend towards authoritarianism. How does the War Measures Act and the Patriot Act and the repression during the G20 summit in 2010 show the need to defend democratic rights? And Dinner with Franklin asks, if neoliberalism is rampant in Quebec, how would a nation of Quebec move toward a socialist society?
Okay, so you've heard the 3 questions, and Kurt will try to paste the other 2 in, if possible, in the chat. And you have up to 6 minutes, comrades, to answer whichever or all 3. And as I said before, the lineup will be John, then Robbie, then Marc. So John?
Okay, you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, well, interesting questions.
Wait a minute, John.
Yes?
There's more questions.
No, they asked me to speak to those questions.
Yeah.
Okay?
Excuse me. Okay, go ahead, John.
Sorry. With regard to the FLQ, you know, over the 50 years, there's been a lot written about the FLQ, and a lot more is known than we knew at that time. Just a few things in the way it struck us then. First of all, the FLQ was a brand, not an organization. That it was an idea of direct action outside the law that could dramatize the case of Quebec for liberation and inspire people. Now, we had a lot to say about this in the Ligue for Socialist Action at the time. And you actually can read this because there is a very extensive archive on the events of the October crisis and the War Measures Act that you will find on the Socialist History Project. That's Socialist History Project. It's a website. Go to Documents, look for Ligue for Socialist Action, Ligue socialiste, Ouvrier, and then look for the October crisis. There were ties of sympathy between the FLQ activists and those around them and broader movements in other countries. And a lot could be said about that. And that included Cuba. But we did not have direct contact with this movement, and I'm not the best person to speak on this in detail. With respect to repression, well, yes, it was amazing. The rights that we had, that we thought were in some way guaranteed, were not guaranteed at all. Just a stroke of the pen and they were vanished. They had been destroyed. Now, since then, we have the Charter of Rights and Freedom. It's worthwhile looking at what it actually says. Now, I'm going to paraphrase it here. I don't remember the exact words, but the Charter of Rights and Freedoms say that the people, the citizens of Canada, are guaranteed all the following rights unless there's some reason not to guarantee them anymore, or unless the government has a different point of view. The whole thing depends on the point of view of the government, whether at any one given time it's appropriate to provide these rights or not. Now, in addition to that, even when they provide basic rights of speech and assembly and so on, they don't really at all, because they have their own secret police who violate all this in practice. For example, when I mentioned how the cops raided a farm in rural Quebec, on one occasion the cops actually burned down a farm, engaged in arson, because they feared that it was being used by radical activists, where they did everything they could to make it impossible for radicals to voice their views and so on. The people were harassed, they were libeled, they were slandered, they were driven out of their jobs. including me, by the way. That's another story. My own troubles with the secret police lasted several decades and were never satisfied properly. But it's one thing what the government says your rights are. It's another thing what they want to provide you, and it's another thing what you take. You see, and that's the real story of the War Measures Act, both in Quebec and in Toronto and in Saskatchewan, is that the pushback, the protest movement, we didn't ask anyone's permission to exercise rights. We simply exercised them. And by exercising them, we reasserted them. And we pushed the War Measures Act aside in reality. It was eventually replaced by some other repressive laws. They can pass repressive laws. That doesn't mean they can necessarily carry them out in practice. Now, in the War Measures Act, there's generally overwhelming opposition to those kidnappings. We in the revolutionary movement always stressed that that the violence was coming from the state, not from the kidnappers. But the opposition was overwhelming, including in Quebec. On the other hand, there was a core of activists in the socialist movement and the nationalist movement and so on that refused to give way and that pushed back. And in this way, we were able to reestablish rights in practice fairly extensively and fairly quickly. So that's the basic lesson of the War Measures Act. Your political rights are only what you fight for and win in the struggle. I think I probably hit about my 6 minutes.
Yes, you have. Thank you, comrade. Okay, Robbie.
Thank you. Well, I don't have a lot to add. I think that John's remarks were very apt. I'm only sorry that we didn't have access to the deliberations of the LSO at the time out in Saskatchewan. I think it's important to see the War Measures Act as a continuation of previous repressive actions and laws of the Canadian state, going way back to before the First World War, really. And we shouldn't have any illusions about that. And John pointed that out very eloquently, that the freedoms, democratic freedoms of assembly, the right to publish and speak, are not guaranteed at all by any document, and are at the discretion really of whatever group is in power, whatever group representing the ruling class is in power at the time. In the case of Quebec, 1970, you had a Liberal government in Ottawa headed by a prime minister from Quebec who was absolutely determined to use this as an opportunity to crush the sovereignist movement, the independence movement in Quebec, and tried to do so. I think unsuccessfully, but he did try, and we have to keep that lesson in mind. I think the analogy with Catalonia is a very, and other instances of oppressed nations within advanced capital states like Spain or Canada is very apt. Of course, there are differences in these situations, and there's different rhythms and tempos of the struggle for national liberation in each of these cases. And struggle in Catalonia has certainly been more active recently, but it also faces considerable not only legal repression but physical repression, with jailing of prominent nationalist politicians, etc., in Catalonia. I would point out one other fact which should be mentioned. I think was that this was I don't usually have a lot of wonderful things to say about T.C. Douglas, father of Medicare, yes, but the real struggle to introduce Medicare came after he left provincial politics and depended really on mobilizing the ranks of the labor movement, the farm movement, and the base of the CCF. That's who really rescued Medicare in Saskatchewan. But Douglas deserves some credit for introducing the legislation to which he was personally committed. He really had his moment of glory, I think, because he did oppose the War Measures Act. Now, he opposed it almost exclusively on civil libertarian grounds, but he took a stand that was not popular. So it shows you that in certain circumstances where the relationship of forces is in favor of radical change, that even social democratic politicians who might be disposed to capitulate in other circumstances can be led to alter their position and take a somewhat stronger one that they might not have taken in previous times. So I think we have to remember Douglas's opposition to the War Measures Act as being perhaps his finest political moment, without subscribing to all his politics. But the question of neoliberalism in Quebec, yeah, I mean, well, I'm not sure where the question is coming to. Of course, neoliberalism is no more rampant in Quebec than it is really all over the world. And so the question could be posed as a more general question and problematic, which could be discussed at length. I don't think that a struggle for national liberation that is linked to one of social emancipation will be any less likely to succeed in Quebec than other struggles against neoliberalism. So that would be my opening comment on that. And so I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, thanks, Robbie. Marc?
Wait, voilà. Yes, first thing, I agree with Robbie for Tommy Douglas. I don't know if you look at that documentary of the National Film Board of 1974 that you've received, but I think Tommy Douglas had a very consequential, democratic position, and he stick with it. That was very courageous to have that position at that point, especially in English Canada. As for the FLQ and its internationalism, of course it was. When Pierre Vallière, one of the leaders of the FLQ, wrote his book Nègre Blanc d'Amérique, he was in New York in prison because he had protested in front of the United Nations with Charles Gagnon, another important person in the FLQ then. And when he was writing that book, he was dialoguing with Black Panthers prisoners, and he fraternized with them. Actually, their ideology was not that different. And as I told you, they were very influenced by armed national liberation struggle all over the world, especially with the Cuba situation. And the mistake they made, I think they made a mistake, is that they thought of the Quebec people without analyzing enough the situation as the same as colonial people or the Black people in the United States. But I won't come back. I talked of that early on. I won't come back on it. But you have to understand why Vallière and Paul Rose thought that way. Rose and Vallière grew up in the 50s in a town called Ville-Jacques-Cartier on the south shore of Montreal. This was literally a shanty town. No égout aqueduc, no water system, no, what's the other thing? Égout in English? What's the name of égout in English? Not sure. No bus service, no municipal parks. It was literally resembled a third world shanty town, and they grew up in this situation. It's a bit normal that they thought of Quebec as a kind of third world country. So it's a kind of explanation from their life. I'd like to come back though with Robbie about the independence movement. Is it over? And who cares? Maybe it's over, maybe it's a good thing. Well, don't claim that instead. The liberation movement of the Quebec nation has ups and downs through history. You had up was the 1837-38 revolution, which was not successful. And then you had another up during the Ouvrier rebellion in Manitoba and Saskatchewan in 1870s and 80s. That was another up. Then it went down. Then you had another up in the fight against the conscription in the First World War. And again it went down, and you had another up again against there was a referendum on the construction of the Second World War, and there was a really fight back. The Quebec people were against, they vote no in the referendum of 1942, and the rest of Canada vote yes. There was quite a political movement then. So it went up of course, in the 70s. It went down in the 80s. It went up in the late 80s. And it went down after 1995. Maybe it will not resurrect, but it would be a pity, because the Quebec and fight back movement for its liberation is really pushing a weak point of the Canadian bourgeoisie, because when that movement is up, it really weakened the Canadian bourgeoisie, the Canadian state. And it has that possibility because it's a large nation, there's a provincial government, and a strong economy. So it's a good thing for the left in Canada if there is a Quebec, a national liberation movement. And now the opportunity, I will conclude with that because I see sign on the chat telling me to wrap it up. There is an upheaval by the Aboriginal people, of the Black people, and racialized people in general. It would be a very good circumstances to make link between the oppressed people, the Quebec people, with the Aboriginal people, with the Black people. Unfortunately, it's not happening. It's a pity. It will weaken us and them. And that alliances of oppressed people could be made with the Canadian, with the labor, with the Canadian labor, and it would be possible to have the correlation of force to have a revolution in Canada. But for now, it's a view of the spirit, unfortunately. Merci.
Merci. Thank you. So we will go back to Kurt now to take we have another round of questions, and this time you will have up to 5 minutes each to answer, and the lineup will be John, Marc, and Robbie. So Kurt.
So our first question will be coming from Julius. He asks, what can we learn today about how to defend ourselves from the capitalist state security apparatus from the experience of the War Measures Act? The second question comes from Barry Weisletter. Quebec's advanced position on child care services, advanced consciousness of feminism and LGBT rights, and the existence of a left social democratic party like QS are the results of the struggle against Quebec's national oppression. What do you think will be the next expression of this struggle in Quebec? Will it be radical environmentalism? JPL asks, does the War Measures Act, for our audience, I'll just state that JPL's first language is French, so this is not syntactically correct, but I'll read it verbatim. Does the War Measures Act was extreme and not a necessary decision, or showing the incapacity to handle an ideological movement, or the real goal was to control or destroy any independence movement?
Okay, you've heard the three questions, and Kurt will try to put them once again in the chat. And you each have up to 5 minutes. And we will start with Marc, then John, then Robbie. Marc?
Marc, you're muted.
Yeah, okay. So, okay, the point I want to, it's the last point especially, the War Measure Act was literally fake news, okay? It's not Trump who invented fake news, it's Trudeau who invented fake news. He pretended that there was an insurrection. There was no insurrection. He pretended that there was a government in waiting around the editor of Le Devoir, Claude Ryan. It was mentioned earlier on. All that was invention. The RCMP, the Sûreté du Québec, perfectly knew that it was a small group of young people, not well organized, okay? So, but like it was suggested by GPL, I think, it was so much a good opportunity to crush the rising independence movement. So that's what they did. And there was a first practical result that was interesting. There was an election in Montreal in November, I think, of 1970. And there was a left party has some chances of having a good result around Pontclish. And of course, it just jeopardized their chances. The repression, the murder of the minister, which was not wanted, of course, but it happened, and the repression and the fake news of the coup d'état that was in preparation just jeopardized the election of a center-left wing party in the municipal election in Montreal. So, and after that, it really prepared the ground for the rise of the PQ in the election in 73 and to have the majority in the parliament in 76, because the people of Quebec were sympathetic with the FLQ a lot at with the reading of the manifesto on TV. I hope you've listened to that manifesto. I've sent you the National Film Board documentary, and it was translated in English while the speaker of Radio-Canada was reading them. It's a beautiful text, conjugating the national question and social question in a radical left point of view. And unfortunately, there was a dérapage, and the minister was killed, and that changed the situation. And after that, the PQ road to power was débloqué, was open, and they took it. About the last thing I want to answer, there's a kindergarten in Quebec. There's a bit more social measure than in English Canada. Yes, this is linked to the fact that the combination of the fight back against oppression and exploitation at the same time give more tonus, more strength to the fight back movement. So at the end, you have a bit more social measure in Quebec than in English Canada. But actually, it must be said that the movement in Quebec, social movement or national movement, as I explained in my presentation, is not in a good situation. It's hard to have hope, and that's it. We're in a very bad. I'd like to point to something positive, a hope of some fight back. Let's say the public service Front Commun, Common Front, but it collapsed. And now each union is negotiating separately with the government. That's the first time it happened since the end of 1960s. It's really a weakening, a very strong weakening. And the climate fight back is, there was that huge demonstration, 500,000 a year ago. It might come back, but for now, we're in a waiting period. As for the COVID-19, as you know, the situation in Quebec was really bad. And for the moment, there's no fight back movement against the CAQ government because of that. On the contrary, there's a right-wing movement, which is able to rally thousands of people in the street for the liberty to call it the way they call it. Merci.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's see, where are we? John.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Thanks, Marc. Now, on this question of the present expression of the national question in Quebec, I think what Marc is saying is very important here. That actually a lot of what passes for national feeling in Quebec now is kind of retrograde. That is, for example, the sensitivity around immigration, around immigrants who come from different cultures with different clothing, the question of the veil, of religious symbols, and all that. You know, it reminds me of the Quebec that I knew in the 1950s, because I first went to Quebec in the 50s when Duplessis was still in power. So that's the Quebec I first knew. And it was rather retrograde compared with the rest of Canada on a number of cultural questions. And that retrograde character was an expression fundamentally of national oppression that was being delivered to the Quebecois people, not by a bunch of Anglophones strutting around in their top hats, but by the elite in Quebec, particularly in the Catholic Church and in everything clustered around the Catholic Church. You know, socialists back in those days tended to make a big mistake about Quebec. The only thing I've ever seen written by our movement, the antecedents, the forerunners of the League for Socialist Action, was written by a very famous Canadian poet in 1938 in our press. And he said that Quebec was a feeding ground for fascism. It was so reactionary. That misjudged the situation, because the very oppression, the national oppression that produced these right-wing manifestations was also pressing the masses of the Quebecois to find a way to react. And so without just trying to listen to what Marc is saying here, I don't know Quebec so well today, but I get the impression that there is an increasing pressure on the Quebecois nation in terms of the basic human right to live and function and develop their culture and work in French. And that it seemed to be, we made so many gains in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I'm not so sure now that if the things we hear from Quebec that seem so negative are at the same time a signal that this oppression is becoming more manifest. Anyway, just a thought from Toronto. So take that for what it's worth. Thanks for mentioning the political party, the FRAP, which is a left-wing political party in those elections that were taking place right during the War Measures Act. We mustn't underestimate the degree to which all Trudeau's phantasms about parallel government and so on had to do with the fact that there was a left party in those elections that seemed to have real chances, and the hard, brutal, striking point of the War Measures Act bore down on the FRAP, with their candidates being arrested, their headquarters being trashed, and things of that sort. And yes, it was a real casualty that we were not able to make good subsequently. On the question of how to defend ourselves against the War Measures Act. Well, I'd just like to say this is a very big question on which we might have another discussion sometimes. I think collectively we have a lot of experience in this, and we've learned, if we conduct ourselves right and assert our rights correctly, we are immensely more powerful than the police and the repressive apparatus. So I'll leave it go with that.
Thank you, John. Okay, Robbie. Unmute yourself, Robbie.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Good. Well, I don't want to counter everything that Marc said about the relative downturn in the struggle in Quebec at the present time. Although there are some noteworthy exceptions to that. So I think it's not quite a uniform situation. I took note of over the summer of the big demonstration in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the States. And it was pretty massive, overwhelmingly young people, and not just Anglophone young people, but predominantly, in my opinion, the Francophone youth of Montreal. And so that to me was an encouraging sign. We shouldn't forget also, although it's now fading a bit in memory, the massive student strike of 2000, I guess it was 2011-12, which sustained itself for several months and resisted all kinds of attempts to co-opt it and demobilize it without winning that democratic demand fundamentally for free higher education. That's what the struggle was about. And it would have been the most significant democratic demand since the winning of Medicare. It would have been, about equal to that kind of advance. It failed, but it's not surprising it failed. But it was an experience that nobody who participated in it will ever forget. And it was a movement of the Québécois, the opposition. Well, it incorporated some elements of the Anglophone student population, but really it was fundamentally a movement of majority Francophone Québécois students and youth. And it did not raise the national question, that's true, but it's hard to conceive of that struggle without acknowledging the very particular circumstances of Quebec's national oppression and the volatility of the political situation because of that oppression. That's what gives me hope that we're going to see some surprising developments on the horizon, and that this wave of reaction, while it has a base to it, is not going to be permanent. So I'll leave it there. Certainly in Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste, we intend to be a part of those struggles, which I think will come. And we're living in a period of a certain amount of uncertainty, and as to how the crisis, the multi-pronged crisis of which is both economic, climate related, and health related, how this will unfold. But I think that the revolutionary socialist left, including ourselves at Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste, will have a role to play. So that's about it. I think it was a very for me anyway, very informative webinar. I enjoyed participating in it, and I learned a lot from presentations of Marc and John, and the questions.
Okay. Thank you, Robbie. Well, we have a few minutes left, so we're going to have time for one more question. So but you have to be very precise with your answer, and a very strict 2 minutes each. And the lineup will be John, Marc, and Robbie. So the last question is, Kurt?
Our last question comes from Roy Jones. And the question is, the repression against workers in the Canadian state with War Measures Act was done at the time. What is the current act going to look like? And more importantly, what do workers do?
Okay. I'm sure it's going to take a lot longer than 2 minutes, but comrades, that's all you have. So we will start with John, then Marc, then Robbie. John? Unmute yourself, John.
I'm going to say one thing that may seem remote from the discussion, but perhaps it isn't. There's a very big campaign by the ruling class right now to make it impossible to speak freely about Palestine. Now, why does the ruling class care so much about Palestine? I mean, they cloak it by saying it's anti-Jewish to talk about Palestine. But frankly, why do they care so much? Why do they care so much about making it impossible to publicly criticize Israel? I think it says something about Canada, because the rights of free speech and free expression that they wish to deny around Palestine, once lost, they're lost everywhere. You can't concede on a question like that and preserve your rights on other questions. So I think that is a example of the indivisibility of democratic liberties that have to be developed on all fronts. And that's my answer to the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Marc?
Voila. Yes, to wrap up, I'd like to, I'm dialoguing with Robbie, I think. But I have a trouble understanding the question which is asked, so I'm not really able to answer it. But I want to conclude with Robbie last remark. The Quebec people can rebound very rapidly. Okay, they go up and down. There was 2012, the student strike that Robbie talked about, but that was 8 years ago. There was the big demonstration of 500,000 people with Greta Thunberg last year. So it shows a marvelous capacity to mobilize a lot of people. Okay, but actually it's a down with the pandemic and the catastrophic pandemic in Quebec, a lot more than elsewhere in Canada. It was like a United States situation, actually, that we live, and apparently we're going back into it now. Okay, Ontario a bit behind. Okay, so for the moment, the CAQ government, there's no revolt against the CAQ government. On the contrary, they're very popular. It's a right-wing government, very right-wing government. But the prime minister Legault is intelligent enough not to be Trump-like. Okay, a bit like Ford in Ontario, who changed the style. Okay, so for the moment, really, it's going down. Okay, I don't see anything coming up, but who knows? People and that
30 seconds.
That thing that happened with the Aboriginal woman who got rough racist remarks by a nurse, that doesn't help. It will create in Quebec a reaction by a lot of people, which is going on now. But overwhelmingly, I'm afraid that it will demoralize a lot of people, and it will create passivity. That will be for a while. Let's hope for the future, maybe near future.
Thank you, Marc. Thank you. Robbie?
Well, I'm really not sure I have anything to add. I don't want to, I budged Marc a little bit from his pessimism, but not by too much. He's fundamentally right about the current conjuncture. But I think things can change quickly, particularly in Quebec, and I think even elsewhere, because this system is not going to be delivering anything very soon on the climate crisis, on the economic crisis, and we'll see what happens with the pandemic. So that's it. I don't really have anything more that I want to add. I do appreciate John's remarks about Palestinian solidarity and the need to break the really distressing campaign to suppress free speech on Palestine. This is a product of, it's a product of, it has less power in Quebec, I would say. That's one thing I would say that is a bit brighter here, is that I don't think this pro-Israel line has as much support in Quebec. By the same token, it's actually somewhat more difficult to mobilize even on that question in Quebec, because people aren't as motivated because they don't see an enemy that they have to fight. But Quebecers still have a residual sympathy for the struggles of other small peoples in the world, and they have a certain anti-imperialist instinct, which I don't think has completely disappeared, and I think it will serve us well in the long term, and acts as a counterpoint to the more flagrant kind of imperialist policies that come from Ottawa and that enjoy at least some support in the population in English Canada, which they don't enjoy in Quebec.
Okay, thank you, Robbie. Okay, so special thanks to Marc, John, and Robbie, and of course to our producer, Kurt Young in Mississauga, and to everyone who participated in tonight's conversation. So please consider buying a subscription to Socialist Action newspaper. It's only $25 for 1 year, delivered to your door. And yes, it will be delivered to your door, because after about 4 or 5 months out of circulation because of COVID, it is now back in circulation, and this is the first paper during COVID times. So please subscribe, $25 for 1 year, delivered to your door. Just go to our website, www.socialistaction.ca. That's www.socialistaction.ca, and fill out the form. Also, if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com, or just call us at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. And once again, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. Now, the next SA webcast is on Thursday, October the 8th, 7 p.m., and it is titled The Relevance of the French Revolution and the Paris Commune of 1871, with Cliff Connors, who's the author of the Jean-Paul Marat Tribute of the French Revolution. And our speaker is from the U.S. For the details, just visit socialistaction.ca. In the meantime, please stay safe, stay healthy, and be active. Goodbye for now.